If you ask anybody who graduated college in the last decade what they thought their career would look like, they probably painted a pretty rosy picture: get the degree, land the job, climb the ladder, buy the house, start the family. That was the plan anyway. But somewhere along the way, something broke. Today, having a job doesn't guarantee financial stability the way it used to. In fact, for millions of people, it doesn't even come close. You've probably felt this yourself. Maybe you're working full-time, maybe even overtime, but your paycheck barely covers rent, groceries, and student loan payments. Meanwhile, your parents keep telling you stories about how they bought their first house at 25 on a single income. It sounds like they're describing a completely different planet. Here's the thing, though. This isn't just your imagination, and it's not because you're bad with money. The entire relationship between work and financial security has fundamentally changed, and most people haven't figured out what that means yet. The old playbook doesn't work anymore, but nobody bothered to write a new one. Now, before we dive into why this is happening, I want to be clear about something. This isn't going to be another rant about how everything was better in the good old days. Those days had their own problems, and nostalgia has a funny way of making the past look a lot shinier than it actually was. Instead, we're going to look at the cold, hard numbers and figure out exactly why the job market stopped being a reliable path to financial stability. What I'm going to show you today will probably challenge some assumptions you have about how careers are supposed to work. We'll cover 3 major shifts that have completely rewired the economic game, and by the end of this, you'll understand why your financial struggles aren't a personal failing, but the predictable result of massive systemic changes. The first thing we need to talk about is the great wage stagnation. For nearly 50 years, worker productivity has been climbing steadily upward. People are producing more value per hour than ever before in human history. Technology has made us incredibly efficient at getting things done, yet somehow, wages have stayed essentially flat when adjusted for inflation. Let me put this in perspective. If wages had grown at the same rate as productivity since 1970, the average worker would be making about twice what they earn today. Think about that for a second. Double your current salary. That's not some fantasy number pulled out of thin air. That's what basic economic logic says you should be earning based on the value you create. So, where did all that extra money go? Well, it didn't disappear. It went somewhere very specific, and we'll get to that in a moment. But first, let's talk about what wage stagnation actually looks like in practice. Your parents could afford college without taking on crushing debt loads. They could buy houses that cost 3 times their annual salary instead of 8 or 10 times. They could support families on single incomes and still have money left over for vacations and retirement savings. These weren't luxuries back then. They were just normal parts of having a decent job. Today, even good jobs often can't deliver that same standard of living. College graduates are starting their careers with student loan payments that rival mortgage payments. Entry-level salaries in many fields haven't kept up with basic living costs, especially housing. What used to be achievable with a standard 40-hour work week now requires side hustles, overtime, and creative financial gymnastics. But wage stagnation is just the beginning. The second major shift is how companies have fundamentally changed their approach to hiring and employment. The idea of job security, which was already shaky, has been completely abandoned in favor of what economists call the gig economy and flexible labor markets. Companies discovered they could cut costs dramatically by treating workers as interchangeable parts rather than long-term investments. Instead of hiring full-time employees with benefits, pensions, and job security, they started relying heavily on contractors, temporary workers, and part-time staff. This shift allowed them to avoid paying for health insurance, retirement contributions, and other benefits that used to be standard. The result is that millions of people are stuck in what researchers call precarious employment. You might have a job today, but you have no idea if it will exist next month. You might work full-time hours, but you're classified as a contractor, so you don't get benefits. You might have multiple jobs just to piece together enough income to survive, but none of them offer the stability or advancement opportunities that jobs used to provide. This isn't just happening to low-skilled workers either. Even professional jobs that require college degrees have been affected. Companies routinely lay off experienced workers to hire cheaper alternatives or outsource entire departments. The promise of career advancement within a single company has become largely meaningless when most people will change jobs every few years, whether they want to or not. Meanwhile, the third shift has been the most devastating of all, and it's something that rarely gets talked about in mainstream discussions about the economy. The entire structure of how wealth gets distributed has been completely re-engineered in favor of capital owners over workers. Back when your parents were starting their careers, companies operated under what economists call stakeholder capitalism. The idea was that businesses had obligations not just to shareholders, but to employees, customers, and the communities they operated in. Executive compensation was tied to long-term company performance, and there were social expectations that successful companies would share their prosperity with the people who made that success possible. That model got thrown out the window sometime in the 1980s and replaced with shareholder primacy. Suddenly, the only thing that mattered was maximizing returns for investors, and everything else became secondary. This shift had profound implications for how companies treat their workforce. When a company becomes more profitable, that extra money used to get distributed fairly broadly. Workers got raises, benefits improved, facilities were upgraded, and communities benefited from corporate investment. Today, those profits flow almost exclusively to shareholders and executives. Stock buybacks have become the preferred method of returning value to investors, which inflates share prices but does absolutely nothing for the people actually doing the work. This explains why corporate profits have reached record highs, while worker wages have stagnated. It's not that companies can't afford to pay more, they're making more money than ever. They're just choosing to distribute that money to people who already have wealth rather than the people who create the value in the first place. The numbers on this are genuinely staggering. Executive compensation has increased by over 1,000% since 1980, while average worker pay has grown by just 12%. The ratio of CEO pay to average worker pay has exploded from about 30 to 1 in the 70s to nearly 300 to 1 today. We're not talking about small adjustments here. This represents a complete redistribution of economic rewards away from labor and toward capital. But here's where it gets really insidious. This isn't just about the ultra-wealthy getting richer while everyone else stays the same. The concentration of wealth at the top creates ripple effects that make life more expensive for everyone else. When the wealthy bid up prices on housing, education, and healthcare, those costs get passed down to everyone who depends on wages for their income. Housing markets are probably the clearest example of this dynamic in action. Wealthy investors and corporations now own significant portions of the housing stock in major cities, treating real estate as an investment vehicle rather than a place for people to live. This drives up prices far beyond what local wages can support, forcing workers to spend ever larger portions of their income on basic shelter. The same thing happens in education. When wealthy families can afford to pay premium prices for elite schools and tutoring, educational institutions respond by raising their prices across the board. Student loan programs allow schools to capture those higher prices even from middle-class families, but the debt burden falls entirely on the students. So there you have it. Wage stagnation, job insecurity, and wealth redistribution toward the top have fundamentally broken the connection between work and financial stability. Understanding these forces won't magically fix your bank account, but at least now you know you're not crazy for feeling like the system isn't working anymore, because it's not. The game changed, and nobody told us the new rules. But that's exactly why we need to start writing them ourselves.